Welcome to the world of Diablo.
It burns!
I'm your host, Scott Diablo Marcano.
Well, I'm not a crook.
I'm a filmmaker and comic book publisher, and I want to talk about something that's cool, or interesting, or entertaining, or gets us thinking.
Whoop-de-doo! What does it all mean, Basil?
So take a deep breath, take my hand, and let's take a journey together through the twisted world of Diablo. This is the most despicable crap I've ever heard. Mr. Jones, my 9th grade history teacher, roared in front of the entire class at Malibu Park Junior High. In his hands, he held a small portable cassette tape. "Which one of you is responsible for this garbage?" he demanded. Mr. Jones was referring to the first draft of an audio project my group had made. The assignment had been to create a fake radio broadcast about an important moment in history. My 3-person group, which consisted of myself, my best friend Matt Thee, and one other student, had been assigned to do a newscast about the Mexican-American War. Matt and the other student had chosen to do the written essay portion of the assignment, while I had volunteered to write and perform the radio broadcast. Mr. Jones had instructed us to make it informative and interesting. I thought I had followed his instructions perfectly, but obviously, things hadn't quite gone as I expected. "I asked you a question," Mr. Jones repeated in a terse voice. "Who wrote the script for this recording? Was it you, Matt?" My friend Matt glanced at me, then shook his head sheepishly. It was me, sir," I said in a timid voice. "You?" Mr. Jones replied incredulously. Yes, sir. I thought it was funny. You said to make it entertaining, remember?" Mr. Jones stared at me for a moment, grinding his teeth. "I want to see you after class, Scott," he finally said. Several students oohed and ahed. "You're in deep shit now, man," Matt whispered to me. "I thought you said it was good," I whispered back. "You laughed your ass off when I played it for you." "Sure," he said. "It's hilarious. But what the hell do I know? I'm just a kid." "You better make this right, or we're all screwed," Matt said nervously. After class, Mr. Jones gave me a long lecture about how unfunny, racist, and insulting my fake newscast was. He was so incensed by it, in fact, that he threatened to fail our entire group if I didn't redo the entire recording. I promised him that I would. "You better," he warned. "I'm really disappointed in you, Scott. I would have expected more from you, of all people." Mr. Jones was referring to the fact that I was the only person of color in his class and part of a small group of minority students who attended Malibu Park Junior High. Just to fill you in, the newscast in question he wanted us to make was supposed to be a live radio interview from the 1840s about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In case you don't recall, this is the one-sided treaty that gave the U.S. the territories of New Mexico, Arizona, and California after the defeat of Mexico in the war. Inspired by my favorite comedians at the time, Cheech and Chong, I wrote a comedy newscast skit in which a clueless white reporter interviews a Mexican resident of Los Angeles who was outraged by the treaty. I tried to make it funny by putting on a Chicano accent and having the Mexican resident complain about having to live under the rule of gringos, who hated everything brown. "Right down to my pinchy chihuahua and my freaking enchiladas!" I had the Mexican character complain that after the treaty was signed, a bunch of white cops pulled him over on his horse for a busted horseshoe and do an illegal search of one of his saddlebags. I thought the skit was pretty funny and, made a point, even though the voice of the Mexican resident was pretty over the top and a stereotype. Mr. Jones, a passionate liberal, however, didn't get my sense of humor. He told me the skit was utterly racist and disrespectful towards Latinos. I tried to explain to him that it was like the comedy of Cheech and Chong. "Is their comedy racist too?" I asked. Mr. Jones's face turned red with anger. "You're not Cheech Marin, Scott! You're not funny. You're just being an asshole. Record this garbage again." I didn't press the point. I was intimidated by Mr. Jones and shocked that he'd actually called me an asshole. A couple of days later, I re-recorded the entire assignment. This time, not putting on any funny voices or using any humor. I just recited a list of things wrong with the treaty in a monotone reporter voice. Mr. Jones gave our group an A. Afterwards, Mr. Jones pulled me aside and apologized for calling me an a-hole. "Sorry about that, Scott," Mr. Jones said, "but you made me mad. Racism is disgusting. It's nothing to make fun of. You need to put some hard work into learning more about it." "Yes, sir, I will," I said. "Good," Mr. Jones replied. I left Mr. Jones's classroom feeling somewhat infuriated by what had just transpired. I didn't hate Mr. Jones for calling me an a-hole or embarrassing me in class. I understood that he was a nice guy whose heart was in the right place, but even in the 9th grade, his words and actions struck me as misguided. I found it funny, and not in a good way, that Mr. Jones, a white man, felt it was his righteous duty to enlighten me, a mixed-race kid, about racism. He obviously didn't know jack shit about what was going on in my life. In fact, I was already an expert on racism at that point, in ways far more personal and hurtful than anything that Mr. Jones could possibly imagine. For example, I'd known since I was a boy that my white grandfather had disowned me because my father was black. I'd also been told that the Trinidadian side of my family hated my mother because she was white. Kids had thrown rocks at my family's home when we moved into an all-white neighborhood in Los Angeles before coming out to Malibu. By the time I got into Malibu Park Junior High, several of my peers had already given me a cruel nickname they thought was hilarious. They'd call me Niggerano instead of Marcano. Of particular note, there was also one group of dudes from Malibu West who I occasionally hung out with who enjoyed using humor to pick on me racially. Although they claimed to be my quote-unquote friends, anytime I showed up among their group, they'd immediately start telling black and Mexican jokes, laughing like hyenas at the stupid racist humor. Initially, I'd get upset when they did this, but if I told them the jokes made me uncomfortable, they'd just laugh harder and tell me to lighten up. "Yeah, it's just a joke, brah," they'd always say. As I walked away from Mr. Jones's class after his lecture on racism, I thought about those dudes. I wish I had the courage to explain to Mr. Jones my true experiences with racism. I wanted to tell him that he was wrong about my comedy skit, that maybe finding some humor in prejudice is how a mixed-race kid like me keeps his sanity and survives. Now, comedy occupies a strange, unique, but vital space in our collective culture and human experience. Although comedy, and by extension comedians, are often written off as being silly and irrelevant, I would argue that the ability to make comedy is one of the defining traits of higher intelligence for us as individuals and as a species. Why precisely something makes us laugh is complicated and somewhat mysterious. For the sake of brevity, I won't go too deep in the weeds trying to explain it. However, it's worth pointing out that comedy is multifaceted. It can be slapstick as Monty Python, insanely stupid as Adam Sandler, or as sophisticated and nuanced as a cartoon in The New Yorker. Most of all, it can bring us together in a moment of collective enjoyment like nothing else can. When an audience gets a joke together, all the walls of race, gender, and culture that stand between us instantly evaporate, and for a brief instant, we are one as we share a laugh. But humor can also divide us. Comedy, just like comedians, is very complicated and often quite dark. For all its virtues, comedy and humor can easily go too far. Sadly, jokes are often used as a cover for cruelty and prejudice. Just like the kids who habitually crack black and Mexican jokes at my expense at Malibu Park Junior High, comedy can easily become a knife that some asshole wants to stick in your gut and twist around just because they enjoy seeing the pain on your face. In spite of its common misuse, however, comedy is an essential feature of a healthy democratic society. Not only because it entertains us and gives us a bit of levity in a dark, troubled world, but also because it can occasionally enlighten us in a way that no other form of art can. Comedy giants like Lenny Bruce, George Carlin, Joan Rivers, Richard Pryor, the Marx Brothers, Gilda Radner, and the immortal Charlie Chaplin have not only made us laugh, but have, in their own modest way, changed us and society for the better. Think of all the wonderful and insightful and rich moments comedy has brought us. Where would we be without classic films like The Great Dictator, Duck Soup, Blazing Saddles, or Dr. Strangelove? Or shows like South Park, All in the Family, SNL, Seinfeld, Roseanne, or In Living Color? What would our political and cultural discourse be like without political cartoons? or the biting wit of stand-up comedians and late-night talk show hosts. Among other things, the virtue of humor is that it allows us to lower our guard for a brief moment, to be less defensive and open to seeing the world from another person's perspective. Comedy creates a collective safe space where we can find amusement in the darkest truths, the most intractable conflicts, the most searing of pain. Jokes permit us to explore the problems of race, relationships, gender, sexual identity, politics, with an honesty and openness we rarely allow in other facets of our lives. We need humor. It's the highest form of free speech, in my humble opinion. Societies without comedy are truly dark places. It's no coincidence that authoritarian dictatorships don't allow their citizens to crack jokes about the government. Stopping comedy is the first item on the to-do list of crushing the human soul. The thing about comedy, however, is that it requires enormous tolerance in order to thrive. Comedy, by its very nature, cannot be controlled, safe, or nice. It cannot be subject to rules. It will offend. Comedy is a take no prisoners, spare no sacred cows type of enterprise. Trying to make it politically correct or walling off certain topics and groups as being off limits is never going to work. Not if we want real comedy to exist. Everything and everyone must be fair game. That's why I can't join in with the cancel Dave Chapelle crowd. Yes, I understand that the LGBTQ plus community is often the butt of cruel jokes, and trans people in particular are a community under constant attack. But to be fair, I don't personally think Dave's intent was to get a cheap laugh off of trans folks in his Netflix special. Dave's routine that became the basis of the controversy was actually an insightful story about a trans individual who was a dear friend of his that committed suicide because their own community turned on them for embracing him. It's a tragic story, not a cheap attempt at a laugh. Then again, I'm not part of the transgender community, so me saying, get over it, it's just a joke, perhaps is no better than the dudes from Malibu Park Junior High who told me to lighten up whenever they told black and Mexican jokes. Jokes do go too far. Some cause them enormous pain. However, I think intent is an important part of this. I don't believe Dave Chappelle's intent was to get a cheap laugh, and that to me is the difference between him and my tormentors in junior high. To be honest, I'm very concerned by the growing inability of the left lately to recognize the importance of intent when it comes to comedy. But it's not just cancel culture that concerns me. It's the growing intolerance of society in general to take a joke that gives me great pause and concern. The ugly spectacle of Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars laid bare the desperate need for tolerance when it comes to humor. Some might be tempted to say that the cancel Dave Chapelle crowd is not jumping on stage and slapping him. They're just asking him to be held accountable for his hurtful words. But in demanding his cancellation, they are in fact trying to remove him from the stage. Demanding that Dave Chapelle be thrown off of Netflix is pretty much screaming, "Get transgender people out of your fucking mouth!" Just without the slap. As much as it pains me to see people who are part of a marginalized community being picked on, it pains me more when comedy becomes censored. Any sort of unwritten rules or walling off of particular groups and topics is off limits when it comes to comedy is a very slippery slope indeed. Were the cancel culture crowd to get their way, one has to ask, where would this all end? What's the next logical step in this war on political incorrectness? Are we going to create a national comedy commission to dictate what is or is not acceptable humor? Are we going to pass laws and ban any comedian who makes unwoke jokes about obese people, disabled people, women, people of color, etc., so that the only group that can ever be made fun of is cis males? As righteous as that may sound to some, I think that's a fucking joke. No pun intended. In fact, it pains me a great deal as a progressive to see the left become so intolerant. Every joke does not have to be progressive or come from a leftist slant in order to be funny or acceptable. We will not change society for the better by canceling everyone who cracks wise or we happen to disagree with. You can't preach tolerance by being intolerant. I guess I can relate to Dave's fight against cancel culture in part because when I was a student at the University of Santa Cruz, I took my humor too far, and I was almost canceled too. I won't go into all the details of this, which I've covered in other essays, but in short, I made a satirical cartoon about racism on campus that rubbed many people at UCSC the wrong way. Instead of seeing my cartoon as an attempt to point out racism, many took it as me trying to get a cheap laugh by being a racist. My cartoon was extremely edgy, I admit, but my intent was to make people think about racism. Unfortunately, it probably went too far and people got mad. Fair enough. I knew my cartoon would be divisive. Like Dave, I offered to meet my critics in public to discuss their criticism on my satirical humor, but no one took me up on my offer. Instead, a few students tried to use violence against me. One tried to pick a fight with me in the Porter College cafeteria. Another student waited outside my dorm room one morning and tried to stare me down while blowing cigarette smoke in my face. He looked like he was going to pull a Will Smith on me, but when other students arrived, he finally backed down and walked away. He let it be known, however, through other students, that he was still quote-unquote gunning for me and that I should quote-unquote watch my back. In addition to the threats of violence, several administrators and students demanded that I be kicked out of the university for my offensive brand of humor. But since they couldn't prove my intent was to be racist, the effort failed. Undeterred, the head of the Porter College Housing Authority told the RA on my dorm room hall to dig up dirt on me so she could file a falsified housing complaint against me and get me kicked out of the dorms. Fortunately for me, the RA on my hall refused to play along and the scheme failed. But it's scary to think what would have happened had my critics succeeded. I might have lost my enrollment at the university or my housing, all because I drew a cartoon that people didn't like. So when people argue that cancel culture isn't really a problem and Dave didn't really get canceled, yada yada, I have to call bullshit. The problems I experienced at UCSC have become more mainstream and aggressive over the years. Dave Chapelle is a big enough celeb to escape relatively unscathed from the Twitter mob, but there's plenty of smaller fish out there who aren't powerful or famous enough to avoid being canceled. Heck, one only need to look at Patton Oswalt's shameless denunciation of Dave Chapelle after Chapelle threw the idiot a bone and let him open one of his sold-out shows and he was criticized for it, to see how potent the fear of being canceled is these days. It's a situation not unlike the French Revolution, where a once righteous cause gets overtaken by zealots who use the power of the mob to terrorize everyone else into following their orders. Now, to be fair, I do understand the point is not that all humor is intended to enlighten or entertain. Many jokes serve no purpose other than to hurt and humiliate people on the basis of their race, culture, sexual identity, etc. All too often, humor is a fig leaf for prejudice and bigotry in our society. However, one must also recognize the difference between a bunch of idiots making gay jokes at a frat house and a professional comedian making an edgy joke on stage. After all, it's not just what somebody literally says. As I said before, it's the intent that matters. There's a reason I laugh out loud when Cartman dresses up like Hitler on South Park, and I get angry when I see neo-Nazi memes online. Both use humor and Nazi imagery to convey a message, but the intent of one versus the other is completely different. As a society, we do well not to lump the two together as if they're the same thing. In either case, I don't believe the solution is to cancel and or swat somebody in the face every time you don't like their joke. The solution is to realize that humor, even the ugly, hurtful kind, is essential to democracy and free speech. We have to develop a thicker skin when it comes to these things and learn to take the good with the bad when it comes to comedy. In fact, it's vital that we do so. For cancellation won't stop at getting the Dave Chapelles of this world off of Netflix. Ultimately, it will lead to what we saw on Oscar night becoming the norm, jokes leading to violence. And that's not something I think any of us want in our free society. Now, back in the day when I was being tormented by that group of dudes who used to tell black and Mexican jokes whenever I showed up, I could have resorted to violence to stop them, but I didn't. To be fair, I didn't really have that option anyway, as I was greatly outnumbered by them, so slapping one of them would only have resulted in me getting my ass thoroughly kicked. But I did find a creative, funny way to make them stop. One day, by chance, we were all waiting at a bus stop together to catch the RTD into Santa Monica. As soon as the dudes saw me, as usual, they started in with all their black and Mexican jokes, laughing their fool heads off, while I just stood there and took it. Finally, the bus arrived, and we all got on it together. Well, on this particular bus, the driver just happened to be a middle-aged African-American man. He was big and muscular and had the demeanor of someone who didn't take shit from anybody. The bus was filled with mostly Latino men and women who were going back to Los Angeles after a long, hard day of work. As soon as my friends saw the demographics of the bus, they immediately stopped telling their racist jokes. One of them said quietly to the others, "Chill, dudes." I decided not to chill, however. So in a loud voice I said, "Go on! Finish your joke, dude! Don't stop! Let's hear it, the rest of it! How come black people eat so much fried chicken?" The bus driver immediately whipped his head around and glared at us. Panic exploded across the faces of all the dudes. One of them whispered to me, "Shut up, Marcano!" But I kept going, talking so loud that the entire bus could hear me. "I don't know what you're embarrassed about, dudes," I said. "You guys were just telling me all these hilarious black and Mexican jokes while we were waiting for the bus. You have nothing to be embarrassed about. They're just jokes, right? That's what you're always telling me. I'm sure everyone on the bus would love to hear them, too. Go on, tell the other one about how lazy Mexicans are." At this point, all the passengers on the bus were staring at us with hostile expressions on their faces. My friends all turned completely pale. One of them tried to cover his ass by announcing to everyone, "Ha ha, he's just kidding, folks!" At that point, the bus driver angrily closed the door behind us. "Find a goddamn seat," he barked at us. The dudes quickly shuffled down the aisle to the very back of the bus, walking with their heads down, staring at the floor to avoid eye contact with the other enraged passengers. As I followed them back to the back of the bus, I glanced over my shoulder at the bus driver, who gave me a small, subtle smile. He obviously understood what my intent was. Watching those cocky dudes walk like scared little mice to the back of the bus was priceless. I started laughing uncontrollably. After we all sat down, one of the dudes whispered to me, "You're a real asshole, you know that, Marcano?" "So I've been told," I replied. I have to admit, what I did wasn't very nice. But you want to know something? After that, those dudes never cracked another black or Mexican joke when I was around. So, my friends, I will conclude this essay podcast by quoting the great comedian Steve Martin, who once said, "Comedy isn't always pretty." Truer words were never spoken. Humor can be a weapon or a revelation, depending on how it's used. But whatever the intent, one thing is clear. We need comedy in our lives. For there are few joys richer in this existence than having a good, long laugh. Especially when you get the last one.